Hey, this is Joel Duff. Episode 53 of This Week in Creationism premieres later this evening. I recorded that yesterday, but I didn't know that Answers in Genesis was going to come out in their Answers news program today and talk about Homo naledi. So, special edition This Week in Creationism. Answers in Genesis doubles down on Homo naledi physical and spiritual status. Let's talk about that coming up. Answers in Genesis has a live news program that they run twice a week. And here you can see when I took the screenshot of this particular one, it streamed just 59 minutes ago. And within this one, well, apparently you've been lied to, but that's about something else. Well, I guess they could also say that you've been lied to about Homo naledi as well. Embedded in this particular news program was some comments they made about the newest discoveries with Homo naledi. Let's take a look at those. But before I do, I have to give you a very, very brief review of the situation. Homo naledi are a large set of enigmatic bones found deep in a cave in southern South Africa. And when they first came out in 2015 through 2017, there was a lot of discussion among young Earth creationists about what are we going to do with these bones? Are they are they descendants of Adam and Eve, or are they not part of the human lineage and therefore just apes? And so I created this scorecard at the time, which hasn't changed a whole lot over the last 6 years. And we see that Answers in Genesis, they had claimed after they did some examination of the bones, not actual examination of the bones themselves, but of all the reports from the bones, they did their own analysis, and they decided this is clearly just a form of an ape that accidentally got into this cave, and we have their remains there. So they're soulless creatures. They seriously doubt that the original owners of those bones were descendants of Adam and Eve, right? They say the preponderance of evidence at the time, right, 6 years ago, suggests that these were just animals, just a variation of apes. Contrasted to that was Creation Ministries International, which said they're probably human but had pathological features. So they are descendants of Adam and Eve. And the Core Academy of Science and some other creationists associated with that, but specifically Todd Wood, he stated that he thought they were fully human. In other words, they are descendants of Adam and Eve, and therefore it should just be included in the human race. Now, in This Week in Creationism, episode 53, which is going to premiere a little bit later, I talk about Todd Wood's response to Homo naledi because he has written a blog post about it, and he has said, well, the discoveries of potential fire, potential art or drawings of some kind, and what he thought was very strong evidence of burial, right? All of those, he said, combined to strengthen his particular position or his viewpoint that these were the remains of human beings, descendants of Adam and Eve. So I asked the question in that show, well, what about the others? What will others do? What will Answers in Genesis do? Because they were committed to this fully ape interpretation. And I said there was a couple possibilities. One, I said they could just ignore it and hope it kind of blows over and doesn't catch any attention and they don't get asked about it. Well, that didn't happen because they responded to it. So they felt like they had to say something about these recent discoveries. The second thing I said they could do is they could address it, but they could simply explain it away. They could say like, there was other organisms, there's actual human beings came down and made that art and maybe buried the bones, or maybe other human beings made the fires and it wasn't actually the owners of the bones, right, that actually did it. And they'll use were you there? Were you actually there to see the individuals whose bones these are actually making that artwork? And if you weren't, then how do you know that's the case? So they would just continue with their, hey, look at this. We think that that's just an ape. It doesn't matter with all these other things that were found there. They're not necessarily connected to the bones themselves. So that was another option. And of course, the other option would be to reevaluate their original position and say, well, look, there's a whole bunch of new evidence, and maybe if we reevaluate what we thought of the skeletal remains, we might convince ourselves that, in fact, they are more human-like than they are ape-like, and therefore they are descendants of Adam and Eve, right? That's their three choices. So what have they done? Well, I already indicated what they did in my promo. I said they've doubled down. They have doubled down and they simply are denying that there's any significance to the new findings, that it doesn't convince them of anything new, that Homo naledi was simply just an ape. So here we go. Here we have our Answers in Genesis news team. That's Bodhi Hodge on the left. And he is, first Patricia Engler, who's on the right. She begins to talk about, she introduces Homo naledi. What's interesting is the way she approaches talking about these bones. She mentions this chamber that's at the bottom of like a 3-story chute, and then there's just sort of bones scattered across the floor of this. Very much giving her audience the impression that this is just bodies that have been thrown down or fallen down into a deep cave, and then they died and their bones are scattered out there. And she also gives the impression that maybe these markings are down there, and that maybe the fire was actually down in this particular portion of the chamber, which I don't think actually there's any evidence of either of those there. The markings or the engravings were found in another part that's a much more accessible part of the cave. And she also doesn't mention that Homo naledi bones have been found in multiple different chambers in multiple different locations of the Rising Star cave system now, not just in this single chamber. So the way she introduces the topic itself leads the audience to believe that there's all these bones are found in one place, and they're in the extremely inaccessible place. And it doesn't make any, and so that implies it doesn't make any sense that anybody could actually climb down there and actually bury something or create art in that particular location. So she's not really accurately portraying the actual situation, the actual evidence of the site. Then Bodhi Hodge sort of grabs onto that, and he immediately starts talking about how Homo naledi is just an ape. All right, and he's talking about how you have to be really careful when you talk about things like writing, because obviously writing and making these symbols would be human. So they admit that if this writing was, or they don't say, he doesn't say it right out, but he certainly gives the impression that if you really could connect this writing to these bones, then we'd have to reconsider. But how do you know? And that's basically what he says. How do you know? How do you know that they made that writing? And Patricia Engler ends up reading a little blurb from a skeptic, which talks about how, well, we're not absolutely certain that these writings were made by Homo naledi, and that's actually part of the original paper, right? The authors of this paper say that we can't make that direct connection. It's an inference, but it's the best, simplest explanation for the observations we've made. And I said in my video, and I say in my second video, that it's not the strongest, most convincing evidence ever that the individuals' Homo naledi bones are associated. The individuals of those bones aren't necessarily associated with that writing. But here's what's really interesting about the way Answers in Genesis spins all this, right? They came in knowing that they've called this an ape. And so they're very careful in how they talk about the new evidence and how they dismiss little pieces of that new evidence. And the best way to dismiss evidence is to simply not talk about some of it. And what they didn't talk about was the evidence of burial, right? The physical evidence of bones that are buried. And that's what Todd Wood picks up on. And Todd Wood, and I agree with Todd Wood, that is the strongest piece of evidence. Of all the different forms of evidence that would be connecting Homo naledi to an actual practice, all right, a human-like practice. That was the best evidence, the best supported evidence. And although the word burial was used once in their 5-minute discussion, they didn't actually talk about the burials, and they didn't actually talk about the significance, potentially, of the burials. So they focused on the engravings, all right? They focused on the pictures, and which was the weakest form of evidence. So in other words, the easiest form of evidence to attack is the evidence that they jumped on, right? And so they assure their audience is you know what, these are clearly apes. And of course, then you've got Bodhi Hodge going all on about how the slope of the face and it's a small cranium, and clearly this is just an ape. And I talk again. He's making fun of the reason he has glasses there on the human skull, because he's talking about how apes can't wear glasses because they don't have a nose bridge and so forth. And he's holding up this skeleton, which he does mention very briefly is a chimpanzee, But for the most of the time, as he's talking about it, you'd think he's holding up Homo naledi, because he's trying to say Homo naledi is just like this chimpanzee skull. Well, I have these pictures below showing Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, and Homo naledi, showing that Homo naledi has a slightly more sloped jawline, right, front of the face, but it's nothing like a chimpanzee, right? Their brain case, the number of features of the brain case are far more human-like than they are like a chimpanzee. And what you see Bodhi Hodge doing there is trying to create this incredible contrast between the two, and then he's just saying, all right, as if, believe me, Homo naledi looks just like a chimpanzee. Should also note that Homo habilis, Answers in Genesis says, likely human, and I think more recently, definitely human. Homo erectus, definitely humans. Homo floresiensis, definitely human. Homo naledi, not a human, right? For reasons that are not actually clear to me anymore. Well, so there you have it. Answers in Genesis, just doubling down on their previous opinion that these bones represent something that's an ape and not human. But here you've got Creation Ministries International. You have other creationists. I would say maybe something close to the majority of other practicing young earth creationists feel like these bones represent something that's a descendant of Adam and Eve, and therefore they would consider human and would have a soul and be representative of having the image of God, right? Whereas Answers in Genesis saying, nope, just an animal. Those are highly contrasted opinions, right? And this is for an organization that often is telling their audience it's very easy to tell the difference between different kinds of organisms that God made. They're made separately. They don't share any common ancestor. And then, as I'm showing here, he's holding up the two skulls, and he is saying things like, see how easy it is? It's obvious these two things are different. If it was that obvious, why do half of the creationists think it's not obvious? Okay, don't want to belabor this anymore. I just wanted to make a short update, sort of an addendum to my This Week in Creationism, which is coming out this evening. So now we truly do have a continued split among young earth creationists on the physical and spiritual status of Homo naledi. We've yet to hear from Institute for Creation Research or Creation Ministries International. Based on what I've seen so far, I suspect they'll all just stay in their entrenched views, and they'll just reinterpret the evidence according to their prior convictions. All right, that's it. Thanks a lot. I'm Joel Duff. Have a great day. Bye-bye.